All right, no more questions from the audience. All the discussion is going to go on in the fishbowl. And to get the discussion going, there's been a lot of threads that I've been kind of following through the last couple of days. And one of the threads that I just want to start the discussion with, it was something that I asked at the beginning when we devastated you with the images that Ranjani gave us. And I said, you know, we didn't say at the beginning that slums were a problem, right? We said that slums are an enduring phenomenon, and then I proposed that maybe they endure because there are powerful people who benefit from their existence. And we know that potentially, and in general, the people who live in the slums of the favelas might benefit from their existence, but there's others that got to benefit. And so a couple of those threads have kind of been unearthed already that I want to kind of pursue. And there's one that wasn't talked about that I also kind of want to add to the room, and this is why we have these folks up in front of you. So the couple of threads that you've been hearing about is what I like to call cannibalistic capitalism, where what we do is we find ways to informalize stuff that used to be formal, and we plunk it into these neighborhoods, like production, right? And so we heard from WeGo, right? When Marty was here, because Marty's not here now, is she? No, about all the informal workers who don't just produce the Gap jeans and stuff, but produce the capital and everything else and take the risk to put cheap products on the table here, right? But we also heard about the informal production of oil that enters the global oil supply coming out of the barrios in Nigeria. And so there was a film made a few years ago called The High Cost of Low Prices. And it was really an indictment of Walmart. But basically, what it does talk about is how we cannibalize ourselves to bring things to market at a price too low. And so Michael and I had a chance to talk about that yesterday. I was going to ask Michael to think a little bit more about this cannibalistic capitalism that I think chews up the lives of people in Nigeria who are trying to produce oil in the wrong way. Right, and then one of the things that Martine alluded to, but I think we want to go into a little bit further, is the ability of developers to use slums strategically. And so one of the things that they ran into in Belo Horizonte is the way that developers would actually game the system to basically co-opt the curative processes of how we try to improve the conditions in slums. And I wanted Enrique to just give us kind of a short vignette on that. And then there was a third stream that has escaped me now, and I'll remember. But I just want to. This isn't about me. This is about you guys, right? And so, the third stream was Kibera. 8% of the people in Kibera own their homes. 92% of them rent. And at least by rumor alone, I heard that one of the main landowners in Kibera was the sister of the former president of Kenya, Moi. And so certainly anybody who's making gigantic benefits out of renting to people in the slums might have very different ideas about what it means to improve the slums and who will benefit, right? So those are the streams that we've already kind of started, and I just want to have at least a little bit of reflection on that. And to show you that this isn't just about the talking heads, we nominated someone from the Spurs group, the MIT students, to join the panel, and he's going to jump right in because I'm sure he has something to say about who benefits from the existence of slums.
Are you a Spurs? I'm not from MIT.
Oh, you're not from MIT, but you're with the group. Okay, yeah, so. You were nominated by some process, so there you go. A little bit democratic, just slightly democratic. So I don't know who wants to start, but let's talk about cannibalistic capitalism. Let's talk about gaming the system. Let's talk about the history of who benefits from the existence of slums.
So it's wonderful to be in Boston because I can breathe. Right? I can breathe. I wake up in the morning and there's no soot in my nose. And if you go to Rotterdam, you will see a formalized process of fuel blending, not illegal, not informal, formal process of fuel blending, which means that fuel blends with 15 ppm will go to Europe and the States, and then blends with 3,000 ppm, like particulates per million, will go to Nigeria. So the informally produced hydrocarbons from Nigeria will go to Rotterdam. They will enter the formal market, and there, through a process of regulatory arbitrage, money will be made, quite legally at that end, by sending it back. Basically, that process relies on people not mattering. And Nigeria is a place where, conservatively, 80% of all physical development is outside of government control. So you can say the whole of Nigeria is a big slum, if you like. I mean, according to Mike Davis, 79% of all Nigeria's urbanites live in slum conditions, right? So Nigeria is a slum. They don't matter. So you can just send poison their way and make them pay for it. So the question is how to give people the capacity to make themselves matter, to reduce the scope of impunity. Because it's not going to be supply side. Because the interests are all about exploitation and maintaining that imbalance. So you have to build robust demand-side platforms which can reduce the scope of impunity, which can allow people to declare that they matter. So community organization is key.
Jump in.
Okay, I think that's a very important and very provocative set of statements, but I want to say that it is important to make the supply side responsive and responsible. And leaving it just to the community just means that you absolve your governments of their basic responsibility. So we know that countries like Nigeria go through processes at times when there is fair elections and other times where it's not fair. But at the times when there are fair elections, you need to bring this kind of stuff back into government and part of their responsibility to help resolve. So that's one comment I'd like to make. The second point I want to make is in response to Mac's argument about, or question about what's going on in places like Nairobi slums, where Kibera is just one of them. So when we did this research, we were shocked to find that 92% were tenants. But then survey data or census data show that 82% of all Nairobi citizens are tenants, right? So there's a 10% difference, but the rest of Nairobi citizens don't own either. And we've done research now on 15 cities in Kenya that shows the vast majority, I think 86 or some 80% of everybody that we surveyed in 15 cities were tenants. And we think it's a representative sample. It may be a little bit off, but so nobody owns, right? The other thing that we did was we tried to do a back of the envelope calculation of what are the rents in places like the slums of Nairobi. And this is dated data. And if you were to take extreme propositions of what percent live in slums, they would say 50%, 70%. But the Census Bureau of Kenya says about 30, 33%. So we used that number, and we used the actual rents that we were documenting through household surveys, and found that about $30 million a year are paid in rents in Nairobi slums alone at this very conservative estimate. So if you're going to enter this place and try to regularize it, you will have $30 million worth of opposition at a minimum in 2004, right? It's the same that's going to be with oil. So if you're going to negotiate on behalf of the community, or suppose you get a progressive government like you had in Medellin, they have to understand what's at stake and see whether you can buy out $30 million worth of interests to be allowed to enter. Right? So this naive thing that you'll just go in and somehow convert mafiosos to your side isn't about to happen. There's money at stake, and it's everywhere in the world. You figure out what is it that's at stake, see whether you can use that kind of information and the power of the community and the right-oriented government or whatever, if there is one, to try and make a dent in that equation, because a naive approach is not going to help us solve this.
Sheila, go ahead. No. Oh, you want to give the floor?
He throws you out.
Well, no, you can voluntarily get out if you want to. Come on, grab the mic. Yeah.
After you.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think having jumped from out of nowhere and sitting here, I'll just try to give a very local perspective of what I think of who benefits from slums. And this is from my personal experience of having lived in a city, in a small town in India, and like having done my field visits over there. And there was this particular slum which was on the verge of being resettled. The notice of eviction had already come. But more than the community, obviously the community was disturbed that they had to go away. But there was this case where more than the slum community themselves, the neighborhood that surrounded the community also came together with them. And the reason why the neighborhood came together was the fear that they would be losing their cheap labor. So in many of these cases, they had this fear that the so-called maids, the security guards, their street food which would just walk around the neighborhoods, and all those people lived in those slums. Suddenly they realized that if these people would be evicted and gone to a place which was 15 miles away, they would not only they would miss all these people, they would have to go through that process again for searching those set of people again, and not very sure of what was happening in that area. So in this case, I mean, as soon as I was told to answer like who benefits from slums, obviously the slum dwellers majoritarily, but then at the case, I think if you just look at an envelope slightly bigger than that, it's the people living around them and overall the entire city as such.
Oh God, I have something to say for each of these.
Well, say it.
So right now, first of all, I want to tell you that
You're on.
you are only because you come from a small town of Behrampur and this is where you are. That was, I think, a very interesting and unbelievable situation that it was such a simple relationship of maids and households that protected them. If you take your envelope and really make it big, the real phenomena that everybody is fighting today are gated communities and people who are the 5% or 3% who own most of the wealth in the city, ready to pay any amount of money because that's cheap change to get people from anywhere in the city to come and work for them, or any other country for that matter, because that's where they are. So if you look at this whole situation of capital reproduction and the whole volume of large houses for a few people is a global phenomena. And your city has escaped it so far, but you don't know for how long. Beware. The other thing is, I want to challenge what she says about naivety. There is very little in today's world where these conspiracies are not provoked and brought out by those who suffer the most from them. That is the beginning. And I want you to see these as beginnings and not as naiveties. If Michael and I come here and talk about these issues, it is to bring people who are like you in the bank, or some of you who are global spokesmen or spokespeople for different causes, to come and add more weightage and more gravitas to this process. Because these are global phenomena. And today, when Michael talks about that, you talk about land, it's very interesting. You go deeper into the land thing than you have, and you look at the origins of who has land in Kenya. It is what Kenyatta, when the first Kenyan president came, he distributed land to people in order to stay in power. And today, it is owned by commercial leaders, military people, by politicians, and by the judges. Half of the places which we go to fight against evictions are owned by the very judges in front of whom you bring all this up. And so it was a collaboration between the Slum Dwellers Federation there and the university and the business school and the law firms that dug out this data. And that's why in the new constitutional process, there are now discussions, because in the original charter, it was given to them to produce industry. Not one of them have produced industry. They hawked it to the banks, took money and started other business. How do it help me? We were given the first piece of land for pavement dwellers in Mumbai, And very wickedly, the local housing authority gave us land that was actually given to an oil company to produce soap, who never produced soap but took us to court for coming on their land. And when we looked at the original papers for them getting the lease, it was to set up industry. We said, 60 years have gone, you haven't revoked it. And so we got it revoked. That's the fight they're having in the Constitutional Court there. So I think the other very important thing is that many of these processes are giving us an opportunity for different resistant movements to meet each other and be very, very strategic. Because today, elites, professionals, mayors, we are all learning global stuff and using it locally. But what about the poor? What about their institutional arrangements? We are all operating in isolation. So I think that you should convert your call to say, how are you going to be strategic to get smart, committed, or transform people who are not committed to be committed to your cause so that this alignment can happen? Because it's only through this increasing voice that people like us are going to be invited to speak at forums where we can raise this in a much global environment, because we may not get that voice in our national environment. And to talk in today's very toxic political environment, to assume that in all the complexities of all the things that our national governments do, they have any time, inclination, or commitment to address these issues is being naive.
Jump in, Enrique.
So I'm going to add to the complexity and bring back another, bring back an actor that has appeared very briefly, primarily with Livia's presentation of El Caño, and that's the real estate development sector and those that are interested in developing land. And so this is a story really both about that actor and where they are and how they're actually almost, with the exception of really Livia, hasn't really been discussed in Martine's presentation, and also the long view, and the long view that this actor takes with how the city develops and where their interests are and how the city develops. The story of El Caño is a story about people mobilizing to preserve land that was ecologically precarious, that should have been received. But then as they built a community, as they established their voice, then there was this cleanup effort. That cleanup effort then was seen as potential for displacement because of the value of the land, not just as an ecological thing, but as real estate because it's close to the Golden Mile. And so that foresight is amazing, and that it's an understanding not only of their history in the community, but it's an understanding of how land gets valued and how they have to protect it from being displaced because now they've actually basically conditioned a piece of land that shouldn't have been developed to be used for the highest and best value. And they were afraid, and so they mobilized for that. The story that Mac alluded to, and this is we're seeing bits and pieces of this in Belo Horizonte. Again, it's not things that we've been researching, but we've been hearing these stories. How developers also can become, do not mind seeing the certain areas of the city, ecologically sensitive areas of the city, being squatted upon, because as the squatters in the slums and the communities develop, they're conditioning the land that should be out of development for future development. So they get to sit there and they watch. And so something that, and wait, and then all of a sudden, well, it's not ecologically sensitive anymore, it's been urbanized. Give it the title, move to the next stage. So that speaks to, I mean, that adds another layer, but I think for me, it's a story about who's, a different long view, and then the strategy of it and the logic behind it. And then something that has been talked about is when you do identify yourself, when your community is recognized, the risk of that is also you're going to have to fighting and getting dirty, getting into the battle. So.
Go ahead, Brody.
So I have basically three things, and I may be, well, I guess I'll be the second to self-eject, but I just want to pose these things as a question. The first thing that I'd like to say is just something that, not very surprisingly, but I think strikingly, has not come up very much in our several days of deliberations, and that is that there's this kind of separation between discussions about the problem of racial inequality and discussions of the problem of urban inequality. And obviously race means something different in every context. When we're having a global conversation, it's very hard to talk about race because every country has its own conceptions, its own way of structuring racial inequalities. But I think that one thing that most of us that study these things can certainly say is that there are very few urban inequalities that don't have a racial dimension. And it's very striking how in meetings of urbanists and people who work on urban policy, how often that issue is missing. And so I think that's worth all of us thinking a little bit about, and I'd like to put it in as a provocation. The second thing I'd like to do is respond directly to this question of who benefits. And as a historian, I wrote a book that really half the book was about who benefits, because the conclusion was that it's a better question to say who doesn't benefit. I mean, if you start at the ladder of how it is that a piece of land comes to be identified as informal, why it is that it ends up with that use, and most importantly in a context like Rio, where a lot of these places really do acquire very high land values very, very early on, why do these places survive as informal when everybody's trying to evict people from these settlements from the very moment that they exist? I mean, the police are coming in, they're burning down houses. You know, the very first eviction attempt, I think, was in 1901 or 1902, and that same community is still there. And so if you don't have a community of interest that wants that place not just to stay in that location, it's not just a defensive community on the part of people who live there, what you have is a constellation of interest in that place remaining not only as a place, but as an informal place. Because all kinds of different actors are benefiting from the fact that that is defined as an informal place. So if you, let's say that you're one of the wealthier members of that community, you can rent out a whole bunch of houses to a whole bunch of people, and that's how you make your living. You're not rich, you're not an outside exploiter, you're an inside person who does this. And yet, if somehow this became formalized and everybody got a title, you wouldn't have that rent income anymore, right? And I've looked at lots of cases of widows who that's the only way that they put food on the table is because they're able to do that kind of internal dealing. So that person wants it to be informal. A politician who all they have to do is look the other way and let it exist, and they don't have any responsibility to bring public services, well, obviously for that person, it's better that it remain informal. And you can even go all the way up the chart in the case of Rio, and you can find very, very wealthy families, people who used to be barons and baronesses, people who, the real estate developer who developed Copacabana, collected himself personally rents in the favela of Babilonia, which is where Orfeo Negro was filmed. So there are all of these, there's just this ladder that goes all the way up and down of people who benefit from the fact that of the vulnerability that is inherent in a place that doesn't have the protection of the law in order to exist. And so that's something that I think is really, really crucial. But I think that ultimately, if we think about what benefits from this cycle, one of the things that also benefits is the very ingrained and persistent inequality of a lot of societies that have large sectors of housing in the informal sector. Because in the end, everybody within the system can get ahead. The poor widow can get ahead. And the person who couldn't afford to pay, in most cases, of a formal rent, maybe this has changed, and Martin has things to say about that, but it at least used to be a lot cheaper, right? So everybody benefits from that. But they would benefit a lot more if they didn't suffer from the cost of the vulnerability. And so over the long run, what informality is doing is it's saying this is a whole group of people who are going to have to pay for their own urbanization. They're going to have to pay for their own public services. Public resources are going to go to that part of the city that's already been developed and where wealthy people already live. And over the long run, what you're doing is really ingraining inequality, right? Because you're privatizing the cost of development for poor people, and you're also privatizing the benefits of public resources for rich people. The last thing that I want to say just has to, and I will self-eject after that, but it has to do with something that I think is really relevant to the conversation today, because oftentimes when we think about, I think everybody who sat in the room this morning got so excited and so interested in seeing the actual craft of people who are doing things on the ground and making a difference in this very concrete way that all of these speakers gave for us. But oftentimes we tend to think of what's grassroots or informal in a positive way, the way that Teresa said, or what comes from the bottom up and what generates up. We tend to think of that in opposition to what's coming top down. And I'd like to suggest that I think it's a lot more useful to think about this as a kind of ecological system, that there's a feedback loop between what's coming from below and what's coming from above. And I think that in a lot of the places that all of us work, what happens is you end up with a perversion of how that feedback loop works. And so one version of that is that the benefits of the grassroots is that it's organic, it's free, it's spontaneous, there aren't barriers to entry, there isn't this definition of things as being outside of the law that ends up being exclusionary. There are lots of opportunities. There are lots of things that are wonderful, both about grassroots problem solving and about informality itself, right? So that's what's good there. But of course, that lacks protection from time, from what can happen over a process of time to change those circumstances that makes it so great. It lacks protection from exploitation, and I don't mean exploitation only from the outside in, but also internal exploitation. I think, Michael, you put it so nicely, sort of saying that community is not an innocent concept, right? And the idea that there is always the possibility of internal exploitation. It doesn't protect you from the will of the majority if you're in the minority. And maybe most important, it lacks the ability to change those aspects of a system where the center benefits from the vulnerability of the margins, right? You can make your own life better, but you're not changing that fundamental inequality between a place that is marginalized and a place that's not. And so in an ideal system, that's when institutions come in. That's when you end up having a certain kind of guarantee of continuity, of citizenship, of basic guarantees that can, in an ideal world, sort of allow for all the spontaneity and everything that's wonderful about the grassroots, but that gives everybody a sort of equal baseline that you can work from. And of course, the problem that all of us face in so many contexts is that there's a complete perversion of that kind of idealized relationship feedback loop between those. Because in the end, what ends up providing continuity and safeguard is the grassroots, because the institutional culture is so terrible. I think Michael Cohen brought this up yesterday, that this idea of, what can you do in an institutional culture where you just don't have the ability to make any of these guarantees. Since that's so bad, then you end up going back to the grassroots as the de facto, as the continuity, as the way that people can get things done best. But it ends up, and this is where I really agree with you, it ends up creating a situation where politics and institutions get let off the hook, and where there's this kind of discontinuity between advocating for the grassroots and an idea that we really do need to create institutional structures that work over the long run on a large scale, like Fernando was talking about in Sao Paulo. So that's it.
You can give your seat to Rahul. Oh, wait, no, Peter, oh, okay, all right. Oh, boy. Oh, Martin, go ahead. You're up next.
Okay, 3 points, and I think I'm trying to address the nexus of formal and informal, because I think that there is an issue about the continuity. The informality comes in many degrees, in many colors. It's not a binary situation. I think we have to develop this a little bit more. But I wanted to address 3 points here about the nexus of formal and informal that has been raised here. First, the case of tenure that Brody brought in. There is this who benefits from there, and we're learning over and over that in the case of Rio, I'll give an example of one of the congressmen that were pushing harder for the full regularization, titling of favelas of Rio, was a guy associated with the Rio State Association, the Developers Association. Why? Because this is the best way for them to actually acquire the land in these well-located areas. And there are a number of cases already of people actually doing that. And there is a famous case also of, everybody knows, but nothing is happening, of a shopping center close to a big slum area. Actually, it's not even a slum area. It's a original social housing project that deteriorated over time, and they're buying one by one these apartments in order to expand that shopping center there. This is just to give an example of that. The second thing, the case of Belo Horizonte that had been raised, it's an interesting case because it brings in the idea of opportunity and that is the case of Isidora, where this has been that has been raised, mentioned by Enrique. The local administration, the mayors there, what they're trying to do now is say, listen, that area has been occupied. The developers are interested in that thing because they want that's an area that has an enormous potential because it's in the very close to the avenue from the airport to the city. So the city is now negotiating with them. You got to put all the infrastructure and building a social housing as part of the negotiation for that area to be developed for you, so to be open for you. So it opens an interesting opportunity for negotiations that kind of a land readjustment that you're doing in that area. And I think we have to also discuss some of these points of if you were smart enough in learning what exactly is happening, who has what kind of stake, and who has what kind of, who can benefit from that, and how you can take advantage of that. This is the point that I'm trying to put there. The third case is a kind of a counterpoint for the Nigeria case, and that is what is one of the biggest spectacular in the world? Popular spectacular in the world. The schools of samba in Rio. Probably, I don't know how many of you have seen any of these things. We're talking about each school, we're having 5,000 components. And that is, the origin of that is fully from favelas. Each favela would have a school of samba. Nowadays, this is completely absorbed by the media. We're talking about each of the costumes may cost 2 or 3 minimum wages. And these are manufactured in a complete dispersed, decentralized way in most of these favelas. Now it's also associated with a illegal game that's called the game of animals. That you can actually bet on this game in New York City. It's another. Brody, you may want to talk something about that because this is taking informality to its highest, and they are the biggest employer of handicapped people, for instance. This is another interesting thing about this game. So in Rio, this game, this is absorbed by the big TV Global TV. That's the 4th biggest network in the world that exposes this for the rest of the world. We're talking about 100-something thousand people parading with spectacular things that costs a fortune of that, and that is the assimilation of the production in informal areas with the absolute formal schemes. So this is a complete amalgamation of the informal and informal. I think we have to go a little bit further of this binary thing of formal and informal, because I think that life is a little bit more complicated than that. I just wanted to put this thing on there.
Jump in.
Shall I go?
Yeah.
At a slightly different level, I want to just emphasize something that I think it's a reality that we've barely discussed thus far, and that's really the internal heterogeneity within these neighborhoods. I'm going to focus my remarks fundamentally on Latin American reality, which I know best, of course. But really, the mixed tenancies, I mean, it's not just a binary owners, renters. It's a multiplicity of tenancies, relationships, expectations. We have owners, we have their adult children, with the expectations of continuing to live in these residences and ultimately to own them. And when I say owners, with or without formal titling and so forth, they are the de facto owners or the de jure owners. But then renters. And a lot of the high densities that we're observing within informal settlements, particularly those that are consolidated, are rental communities, are rental people who are renting, whether that's renting in newly formed or constructed mini tenements, and often those mini tenements will have been developed by another owner in the house in the barrio, or they're petty landlord tenant people having tenants living within the dwelling unit. So you have and some of the worst conditions that I see today in those consolidated settlements are rental housing units. So the critical thing here is that renters have very, very different sets of interests. They have much higher levels of turnover. 1 or 2 years is quite often in terms of turning over. They have a lower propensity or interest even in participating in community development programs. There are often quite high levels of conflict and tension between renters and others within the community. Why is this important? Because I was struck this morning that in Teresa's presentation and then Livia's presentation, Teresa was talking about asset-based development. And I was wondering to what extent, I mean, renters don't usually have assets of any scale. But I wonder whether, to what extent, in those sort of settlements, owners who can sublet or develop rental opportunities, is that a form of asset-based development? And what are the implications of that in terms of internal solidarity and so forth? And then Livia's presentation in Caño San Martin. The emphasis there was very much strong. The success was really the community cohesion and the community mobilization, the community resistance, and then the agreement to build into the community land trusts. My question there was, I wonder to what extent it was a relatively homogeneous in terms of community, in terms of tenure patterns, because clearly there really is the element of to what extent is there rental opportunities being built into that sort of development. I don't know whether you want to respond to that, but it just struck me as that a lot of what with the success...
Conversation that takes place here. You don't talk to people out there. You have to talk to the people in the circle. Okay, remember the rules.
All right. Okay, well, I'm speaking up there. There we are. So these were the... Okay, so to put it in the third person, basically... if you're thinking about some of the success that we've been talking about and looking at in terms of community ability, community mobilization and so forth, one's going to have to recognize that there's a high level of heterogeneity of interest and articulation of those interests within these communities. That's the point I'm making.
Right. Yeah, great.
Before I self-eject, I just want to ask a brief question. What is to be done? Now, of course, what is to be done depends on who you are and where you are. If you command the resources of a department in a unit in the World Bank, you will have a certain kind of approach. Certain things are possible. If you're working in a small settlement in a secondary city in Nigeria, what is to be done is something else. But an important question then is, how can a coherence of effort be achieved across those scales, across those different institutional spaces? Who listens to who? Who sets the priorities? So to clarify, when I speak of a robust demand-side platform, it's not to suggest that somehow that replaces politics. That is politics. And it's to establish the conditions of accountability in which politics can mean for the most people. And you know, to clarify, there have been no fair elections in Nigeria. And so what we have to do is to create the conditions in which they might be fair elections. But elections do not a democracy make. The actions, the transactions, the decisions, the discussions continue. They're distributed through time and through space, through different parts of the city. So how can we create a coherence of effort? What conversations can we have to allow the resources to be mobilized so that we can come at this problem from all directions at once?
Can I? Go ahead, Rahul. And you go next. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask a question to the panel before I evict myself out.
I forget it. Quiet. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, so like for me, the biggest takeaway from majority of the talks in the last 2 days was this greater understanding of having an inclusionary process bridging the gap where you bring as much as community in the policy making process itself to understand its greater needs. My question to the panel, that's what I've been struggling myself in my own words, is in an ideal utopian world, how do you envisage an institutional structure which actually enables the voice of the community to be heard? It's what is the kind of institution? I mean, I don't know if it's a vague question or how it is to be framed, but I don't know, what kind of changes do you want to see in an institutional structure that actually allows the voices of community to be heard?
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Can I-
Rahul.
yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Now that he's
One of you
rejected,
two.
I don't have to answer his question. No.
Okay, good.
No, I
Take it.
actually want to pick up something you said you ended with on the binary, and I think Brody, as she was speaking, I was thinking of sort of going back to, and this is really a comment, and then I want to ask a question. Is again, I go back to the question of scale, because I can't help but feel through these discussions that I think from each one of our disciplinary and operational perspectives, there's a kind of embedded arrogance that we can scale things up. I mean, that seems to be the ambition, that what I'm doing is great and now I'm struggling with how to scale it up. And so this seems to be a kind of linear impulse almost, And I think part of what you were alluding to, Brody, has to do with that problem. And so, I teach urban design here, and I'm sitting in this conference thinking, gosh, this is exactly what urban design is about. We kind of struggle with this idea of how do we intersect the spheres of our concerns, which go all the way from climate change to, everything else, to the spheres of our influence. And I think the arrogance comes from thinking that the spheres of our concern, somehow from whatever discipline we come to, a model practice we're engaged with will somehow connect to that. And often it doesn't. That's where our frustrations lie. And I know with architects, we spend all our time talking about climate change, and then we get to do the interior of a pub somewhere in Massachusetts, And so it's completely impossible to make this connection, So I think so the realization, therefore, that I think the skills, particular modes of operation, disciplines, we've got to find the scales that they're operated and have to be humble about at what point do they need to make segues into other forms, hybrid forms, to be operational at other scales. And urban design, as at least I describe it, is really not even a discipline, it's a practice. It's the practice where architects engage with understanding the abstraction that planning tells them about, ideas, conceptual ideas, and they bridge it with the site specificity of architecture in between. And it's feedback loops, and that's why it made me think, as you were these are critical feedback loops that, and inherently about advocacy, because like I said earlier, I think everyone here is an advocate for what our perspectives are. And so how we create these feedback loops and what scales we actually effectively operate at is critical. And just one last sort of illustration of that is we are, even in this conversation, jumping from the scale of a slum, a settlement, a favela, whatever that might be. Some of us are even showing boundaries. And then the next scale we're jumping to is the regional. We're talking about agricultural production, we're talking about labor markets and all of that. Now, in governance, the metropolitan scale has become a very effective one to think of some of these problems. The problems of the solutions of Dharavi don't lie in Dharavi, they lie in the metropolitan region of Mumbai, for example. And so I think scale, I'm sorry, I'm just sort of flagging out forcefully that scale is critical. And my question, to maybe hopefully open up another discussion, which is linked to this, is linked to what Teresa sort of has really reminded us continuously about, is the specificity of place and therefore the operations and the protocols and procedures that come out of it. And what has frustrated me deeply in this conference as a South Asianist, or as someone from South Asia, is I'm deeply jealous of what's happening in Latin America. I'm just seeing at all scales incredible effectiveness. And we were just talking over lunch that, my God, it's pathetic, we've got places that are 200 years old. The Kolis in Mumbai were the original fishermen who lived on that island. Now we call them slum communities when they're not. They have completely different, they have land ownership, they have identities, but they look like slums because of just the way the city and their poverty and the redundancy of fishery as an economy and all of that. And so I was actually going to pose this to Sheila, with her experience internationally, is how do we understand this? I mean, why in South Asia we haven't made the kind of effective interventions, I believe, much more effective. Well, we all are skeptical of what we might do, but I think there is a difference. Is there some?
I'm dying to talk on this. I think the first thing to acknowledge is that when I was a student in university, which is a long time ago in 1974, I read about the social movements of Rio and Brazil and the whole linkage with the dictatorship and the alternate solutions. But we had no way to understand the details about it. We just heard it like flashy headlines. There wasn't much communication. There was nothing about these things that were taught to us. We used to just hear about Che Guevara and stuff like that, but nothing really deeply understood. The other thing is in South Asia, which is the last bastion of low urbanization, is that in South Asia, in India, nobody talks about urban informal settlements or the urban poor as a group of people that somebody has to do something about. Everything about poverty, rural, is virtuous, They're poor because they have agricultural. Urban, wicked people, come to encroach, need to be sent back. And the whole world and all development investment attitude was sort out the rural areas and people will go back. That was till today, if you look... From Gandhi. From Gandhi. So the whole anti-urbanization agenda and the whole national and South Asian policy, but also within the UN system and the bilateral assistance, you had this deep, deep need to reverse urbanization and take all this clutter out of the city. That was the imagery. So when I started, today something you said really resonated in this panel. I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to the that poor people in cities hated NGOs because it was at your convenience that you threw a stone somewhere, there was a slum that was convenient for you, you did your project and you went away. Nobody bothered that you were teaching hygiene to a community that never had any water. So we were at that stage. And it was a magnificent accident that I met this movement of community leaders who had been fighting evictions for 3 decades before that. And most of them probably went to jail during the emergency. Jokin and company were like that. And so a lot of what we started doing in India came out of those aspirations. But we had no peers. I couldn't find a single NGO who was with me to say that people had the right to define and design solutions. So when you're alone, you look for peers. And I found peers in other parts of Asia. We were part of the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights. Again, a bunch of people who were spread over all the countries, who didn't have peers, who believed that something had to be done for the rights of the urban poor. And it was in 1992 that we got invited to South Africa. And that's the genesis of how SDI began. The rituals that are hegemonic were set up by communities to build their capacity to feel that they could produce voice and agency. And it's now over 20 years that we are there. There's a lot of internal discussion about it. But today, when I see the depth and the scale of the potential of what's happening in Latin America, we have hope. Because we know the terrible conditions, both economic and political, against which this is happening. And we also know for a fact that if we don't learn from these experiences, we will take that many years to do this. So how do we expedite that? But our real challenge is threefold. One, there is no ideal world. We have to produce this demand and aggregate it to produce at least a situation where we don't go backward. That is the situation of a lot of communities of the urban poor. Don't go back, stay where you are. And most of us, what you're doing, what we're doing, is about not going backward. And our alliances will help us aggregate that. The second thing is, all our governments are now producing more and more alliances with real estate developers. In my country, every politician has a construction company. So the world fought a lot to get away from the church and the state. That's going on brilliantly. And now you have real estate, and that's also the real fight. It's not a, it's a real fight. So,
an antidote for that.
yeah. Okay. So the last point that I want to make is that the more information and data that communities collect about themselves and their situation, the more we will be able to find solutions internally to project outside. Everybody's talking about renters. In Asia and Africa, given the huge vulnerability about work, in most of our informal settlements, you have landowners, you have structure owners, and you have renters. And if you're talking, you know, it's very sad that the only two, I'm talking about India, you're talking about Nigeria, and some of us are talking about Kenya, but there are so many countries there that are struggling to deal with this. And so if you take Kenya and you take Nairobi, in most of the informal settlements, 86% are renters, of which 45% rent for not more than 6 months. So what planning instruments are we going to consider that are equitable for all of them? And what rules and regulatory frameworks are we going to produce? And when are all the global South Asian and African professionals and academics going to create the kind of synergy we see in Latin America, of which I am also very jealous?
I would like to pick on that if I could. I think there is a Latin America has many problems, and the slum problem is not easy. But there has been some. We have to recognize, particularly when we pose a question about scales and connectivity, and particularly the articulation of the broader scale, the contextual one, and the local ones. In what condition, when we talk about, it's a matter of changing the politics outside, changing the conditions under which we can operate. Okay. Yeah, no. So just look. Why is that politicians in India? I have to still address her because she was here.
Yeah. Talk to the seat. Yeah.
And not only in India, they are so interested in real estate because they make a bundle with information of where things are going to happen in the cities. They buy land and then they bet on their developments with the information that normally it's not public. Otherwise, this wouldn't be such a good business because buying land in general is not such a good business in general. It's only if you have special information. This is by everywhere that you study that thing, it's not a good investment for a pure investor. It's only if you have that kind of, that's why politicians are own, they somehow they have this promiscuous association with developers. And many of them have. But I would like to say that, and this, he raised a very interesting question that has a deep consequences for what we're discussing here, and that is that why is that in the Matingano project there, someone that in the community is not entitled to sell the property, that they may have the right to sell that and cash the benefit of the increasing rents. Well, this is exactly the problem why we, in the first place, we have to deal with these informal settlements. So if you want to deal with that, and this is the basis of the whole discussion of what are the general conditions that need to be changed if we want to have a certain ground to operate in a more civilized way about how to handle these things. And that is, who has the right on the developments on the development rights, building rights, or changing of rural to urban, that is basically something that you have done anything. This is something that the public has done. This is something that the community have paid for the infrastructure that can support a higher density. You haven't done a penny. These residents there, they are benefiting from something that is happening in the community, but it's happening collectively in the community. It's not their own individual effort that generated that increase of value. So why would they pocket that thing? And this is the basis of the whole story. So that is the story of, for the in the community land trust, you keep that in the community, in the trust of the community, for the benefit of the community. In general, in society, this should go back to the public and come back in infrastructure and service for everybody. And this is not theoretical. This is becoming a reality in some places where there has been experiences that are showing that this is feasible. I'll give you the example of São Paulo or 12 other cities in Brazil that are already doing that kind of thing. But this is a legislation, by the way, that came from the bottom up and was assimilated in the. This is something that has been done, that has been germinated from the grassroots movements, if you want, to a large extent, the movement of urban reform. There was a popular movement in the Brazilian constitution. Just to give an example, so this is not something top down. I know that.
So you got to give me a chance to respond now.
But this is just so, I just want to. I'll leave this and I'll leave the seat. It's just the issue of if we want to address the issue of expanding the provision of infrastructure and services, why not mobilize the land value increments that results from the process that actually generated these slums from exclusion or from at the high prices that someone, if you own land, if you want to put some inclusionary housing in your land, and your land is worth 1,000 because you have an FAR of 5, you would not sell that land for any social housing. But if you only have the right for 200 of this 5,000 of this 1,000 because you have a FAR of 5, and you say the 4 FARs belongs to the public, not from you, you will sell the land for 200 because it doesn't matter if it's going to be a high-end building or a social housing. So with that, you can make it feasible to the production of social housing in high-end areas.
Thank you. So I'm gonna. So I'm going to change a little bit. I'm going to change a little bit of a topic that actually come, I wouldn't say from the name, but someone that talk about supply and demand, but it's a little reflection about constituencies. So the issue about scales, what scales of action we can work on depends on who we are, and then if we are seated here, or if we live in a community, we are in a municipality, etc. And for me, in the supply-demand question,
we'll get you the microphone.
The question and the doubt that I have is whether we have not represented well in this symposium one of the sides of structural inequality. If, as Pancho said, the wage of the worker in Bangladesh is connected to the Gap trousers here, then we should have invited either the person making Gap trousers or international trade organization companies, etc. And this is not a rhetorical question, but it's a question actually about this new urban practice that requires really not a new set of knowledge, like even a new technology, but it really requires different or stakeholders that are part of the discussion. My fear is there is no such stakeholder, meaning no one has been configured to defend the right of outside commodities to go through a process, I don't even know how to express, to go through an environmental revision that fits with my constituency, my population's right. So in this sense, and I'm going to leave the table so that comments are even shorter and we can have a lot of discussion. But the question that I have really is, who should represent that side of structural inequality truly? Would you have names? Professions, and if not, if there is no, then don't we have a very structural problem, which is that there is no one is at the other side of the line of structural inequality.
Okay, here you take this. Sorry, she has an answer to that particular point, right?
Oh, no, it's not an answer, but it's definitely building up on that point, so you can just take them both together. They're actually more than one. So first of all is this issue of structural inequality. And the reason I see, like, for instance, I'm from Egypt, so I will answer from that perspective. So the reason that there isn't as much development and progress in that part is because there is structural inequality. It's built into the system, and that's why there is not as much response to slum upgrading, informal settlements, and all of that. And you can say that it's important to hold governments accountable, and I do believe it should be the case. But if there aren't structures to do so, then what you're essentially saying is, okay, there's nothing we can do because we can't hold the system accountable. And that's why essentially you're saying, so there's no progress that can be done. So I want to suggest something which I think the people on the panel can take this further, which is, how do you think that in the absence of this structure, of the system, of the political will to actually progress, what is it that other entities can do? So how is it that, building on previous ideas that were said, how is it that the bottom-up, in the form of grassroots movements, can work with lobbyists, can work with real estate developers? So real estate developers don't have to be the ultimate evil. They're there because there's money to be made. How is it that you can make money in affordable housing? How is it that you can encourage private sector to come in to this slum upgrading process? Because in the end, if there's no money in it, there are no governments and there is no private sector that will come and invest and do stuff. And in the end, we all need the money for this upgrading process to happen, right? You're not working in a vacuum. Anyone who puts money somewhere wants to see a return. And if you're not able to provide that, whether in the form of an improved labor, more educated workforce, then it's just not going to happen. I'm sorry.
Get in the bullpen.
Sorry, that's the first.
No, I got you.
That's the first point. The second point I want to make, and I will self-eject, is that a lot of people have said a lot of things about community leaders, and I'm sure Theresa will be able to answer this better. But how is it that you deal with conflict within the community? So this is something that Michael also touched on, this idea of exploitation. So I did research on street children, and there is structural exploitation within street children, whether it's 14 years old exploiting those that are 7 years old, and the 14-year-olds are being further exploited by further up. So this idea of structural exploitation, when you talk about community leaders, who are you really talking about? There's no formal election process to bring these people, and when participatory processes have been made, people have been represented, and you always have conflict. So my question here is, how do you deal with this conflict in communities, in informal communities? And I'm sure there are people here who've dealt with this, like this isn't a new idea. How do these community leaders deal with conflict? And how do we choose the community leaders to speak to? If you're talking to a woman, she's not going to be like a guy. She's not going to be like someone who runs a business. She's not going to be like someone who runs off a microbus. As in a microbus, like moving people around, that's what I mean. So all of these different perspectives, who are these community leaders that we keep talking about, and how do they deal with conflict within their community?
Go ahead, Pancho. Go. Been very patient.
I will start by making a relation with this recent intervention. I think that what I feel that in. Yeah, okay. I felt that in many presentations, I felt that what I could summarize as the idea of lacking of internal contradictions in the communities, and this has something to do with something that was expressed in the previous intervention, and this gives me to try to answer to the first question, your question about the question of the definition of the who benefits with slums. And let me start. I have my idea. Probably is too simple. But it's that it has to do with opacity. Slums had to do with opacity. So those are opaque systems precisely because informality, not formal, who, by definition, in my opinion, are not transparent to the law of the state, national state, communal state, whatever, to the law, to that law that has to do with citizenship, with the national citizenship, with a kind of institutional citizenship. So this is the first thing, in my opinion, because this characteristic is what made of the slums a space of fluxus, different kind of fluxus that can function and need to function without the eye looking and the control of the law. So, and I think that we cannot forget this thing, and this is the condition to create contradictions into the slum, into the communities, and which makes more difficult to understand all this process. And I have to say, who are the people who benefit from this opacity? First of all, fluxus of money, fluxus of black money. It was said that Nigeria is 80% opaque. This means it's very simple. I mean, I'm not a statistician and I don't know nothing, but it's evident. It's evident. You can, as you would say, you can enter whatever you want and circulate there, whatever thing. I don't want to charge in the black side, but I think that it's necessary to mention this kind of question. Even drug circulation, even drug accumulation, and deposits. There are many things. I was, for instance, the production of a fake brand. This is something that are free spaces to produce this kind of thing, because they are not controlled, absolutely not. And I know this, and now I'm speaking as Argentinian and from Buenos Aires, and there are enormous centers for distribution of fake brands that are produced with these low wages and this horrible situation by people treated like slaves into the slums. So we need to tell this thing. It's part of the question, and I think we can understand this because if we really understand that the slums are those opaque zones in the society, in the different society, and it has an international dimension, local dimension, etc., etc. So there are many, and it's not about. Now I go to the question of the land, etc. It's not just that I don't think that I agree. Probably there are investors that are not interested in having lands into the slums now. But in my opinion, many politics that are maintaining the low density and not urbanizing in the sense creating city. In the scale of mainly in central slums located in the center, with the density of the city, these are reserve territories. Reserve territories in the deals between landowners and politicians and real estate. In the future, probably those will be lands in disposition for this kind of speculation. And so now I go to the last point, which was the answer to him. Of course, I know that they are interested in and the danger of gentrification in this kind of movements. But my concern in the case of Puerto Rico is that this is, and I agree with you, the same case in Buenos Aires is the Villa 31. It's in the center of the city, and I believe that in Jarabe is the same situation. So this is a the city has there, and not the city. In my country, the country has there one of the most expensive, valuable pieces of land in Argentina. They belong to the country as a seat, as an ideal community. So the distribution of that, the distribution of the enhanced value of this land should be considered in this dimension. Of course, we taking care about the people that is living there, but why should we block this, which is a social capital that could be also distributed, not just to the people who live there, but there are many people living in slums in Buenos Aires without this extraordinary position in the city. Why not? And I'm sure that it's the same thing in other cities. Why don't we could not distribute these values with these people? So this is. I don't know if I'm answering.
He's speaking like a planner, highest and best use. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Asma Ibrahim. I'm a Spurs Fellow. I'm also a teacher and an associate professor at Cairo University. Yes. Okay. I teach at Cairo University. Okay. I also worked since 2002 in many rehabilitation projects in the UN Habitat in Egypt. So I would like to claim about how in Egypt we shifted the ideology of understanding the slums, and also to respond to your question, because actually the policies in Egypt since the informal settlements after 1952 shifted from like total negligence to upgrading to social, physical, and juridical integration. And then we have the participatory development, where we have a lot of funds from like GIZ, from the UN Habitat, national funds, from the Gulf countries, a lot. So there was a lot of conflict. So what happened that we, as a government, shifted the ideology of understanding the slums. That's when, in 2008, ISDF was initiated. It is the Informal Settlement Development Fund. And from that period, actually, slums and ashwa'iyat totally disappeared. Actually, the expression, of course, I mean. Because it has been replaced by what we call unsafe areas, and then we have the unplanned areas. So on the unsafe areas, where have 4 grades, and we have the unplanned areas. In this way, we have an equal distribution for the investments, prioritization for our investments, actually, and to know what's going on in all these areas and who is doing what. In 2014, actually, the 3U's, which is the Urban Upgrading Unit, it was established only in Cairo government and Giza government, and they are working very closely with the ISDF. By the way, the ISDF was a ministry for like 10 months and then got back, but of course, because of conflict in our policies and revolution and so on. But I mean, the structural system, although it has been not a big success in Egypt, but it is really shifted our paradigm for dealing with the informal settlements, and this is very important. Concerning your other question, because I've been working in UN Habitat in the strategic project for small-sized and middle-sized cities. We've been dealing with informal cities, settlement there. What we actually do is that we have city consultations for all representatives of community, meaning that we have the local popular councils, the local executive councils, we have the government, we have the private sectors, we have the NGOs, and we have the community leaders. Of course, there are a lot of conflicts. I have been there for working there since 2006. On many cities, a lot of conflicts, but what we do is that we bring win-win situations, and we have like mutual benefit between all the stakeholders we are dealing with, because we have to bring a common vision. This common vision, we interpret it into like we call projects, and we make a voting on these projects and then allocate it with these all representatives on maps. So this is how we deal with it. However, I would like to argue that for the question of who is benefiting from the slums, I would like to argue it is the international organizations. And why? Yes. Yes. It's a little bit contradictory, but because from my work and from my experience there, I would like to argue this point. First of all, I would like to reflect on Aga Khan in Darb al-Ahmar, exactly. Because for 2 or 3 years, we have been teaching our students how this a success, how they have made a comprehensive socio-economic development program. And they even trained the residents to make restoration for the monuments, for example, for the minaret of Sultan Shaban Mosque. And it has been a real success. Even the rehabilitation of their houses, it has been done by the residents in 3 action areas. However, like 4 years, and I've been working on that on a scientific paper that I have published, what happened to these action areas and what happened to Darb al-Ahmar? It was just a success story for Aga Khan, because of course Darb al-Ahmar is like adjacent to Azhar Park with the excavations of the monuments down there and so on. So they are, I felt like it like propaganda for these international organizations somehow, because yes, because it was not sustainable. Of course, why it was not sustainable? Because a lot of factors, including our government policies and so on, but this is what I feel. Another thing, I felt like working with the UN Habitat so many years, that we have like different international agendas. Like we are moving from MDGs to SDGs, sustainable, resilient. And then they are bringing us TORs with typological sort of logical frameworks that we have to actually implement in all cities. And I'm telling you this from my experience as an Egyptian and as an urban practitioner. Every different site in Egypt is totally different than the other. You cannot actually implement the methodology, even if it is participatory, on all of them the same way. And this is what actually international organizations sometimes cannot understand. That's why, like, I feel somehow they are benefit from the slums. Thank you very much.
When in doubt, I usually blame the UN myself, so go ahead.
So I'd like to respond to a few of the things and comment and bring some more experiences from communities in Rio that might help shed some light on some of the topics that have been brought up so far. One thing is just to clarify, asset-based community development, as we see it, is not primarily about economic assets. It's about all the other assets, which are the most abundant assets in favelas, and which, because they're often non-economic or hard to measure economically, are overlooked. There's a new stream in anthropology called, where they study NELD, non-economic loss and damage. And I think this is a big thing in South Asia, at least as far as I've seen, where there are regions where people are losing their homes due to natural disasters, environmental, climate change. And because most of families' assets are non-economic, they're not measured. And so they're trying to figure out how to measure these, how to recognize these, how to plan with this awareness. And I think we need to bring that into the conversation around informal settlements, favelas, because I think that is where the abundance of assets are. And that plays into why a community like the Caño, from my understanding, opted for a community land trust, because they recognize that the collective assets they had, the ability to stay on the land, the ability for their children to grow up, continue to live, and their grandchildren to continue to live in their communities, all of these were more important to them than the potential to speculate on that land. And that was exactly what we saw in Rio about a month ago, when a delegation of 5 people from the Caño Martín Peña came to Rio, and we hosted these workshops with 130 people from across Rio, from civil society, the State Land Regularization Institute, the Public Defender's Office, over 50 different community organizers, residents, including a Quilombo. There was widespread interest in this model exactly because it allows to recognize those assets in addition. If individual titles are given out, then there are a bunch of negative consequences that come, and communities have only seen that once they've gotten those titles and it's too late to respond. So what we were hearing was people saying, well, when we get the title, after a struggle of decades to get that title, we're not prepared for this whole new series of challenges that come, like speculation, like gentrification, but also the pulverization of community life as people transition into a different worldview, which is based on sort of an exclusively market-oriented logic of assets. So I think that just want to say that I think that's part of the strength of the community land trust model. People can still buy and sell their homes. They can still there's still an active real estate market, but you maintain these community assets. And And I've been to Villa 31 twice in Buenos Aires, and one thing, and I actually think that because they haven't integrated a community land trust model, that they're basically publicly funded gentrification over what would have been much more efficient if they just gave out individual titles without the upgrading. I'm afraid for the outcome there in terms of the community residents that I met that were interested in permanence over speculative potential. But I'm not from Buenos Aires, so I don't have a direct relationship to know more. In terms of community organizing and leadership within communities, conflicts within communities, I just wanted to bring a few lessons. We've put out surveys to residents or the organizers we work with about what kind of training they most want, and number one on the list was unity building. So people recognize there isn't as much unity as they'd like in their communities, and they want to build more unity, figure out strategies for that. So that is something that isn't universal, but you see a huge diversity, like we've talked about in these communities. So there are communities which are quite united. There are others that aren't. We notice in the pre-Olympic buildup, the more unified a favela among 6 other attributes, the less likely they were to be evicted. Because they had developed these essentially keys to resistance, of which unity was the most important. And then just 2 comparisons. I won't name them. There's one favela that we've worked with closely for years in the extreme north zone of Rio, in a very precarious area where there are houses that may fall with the rains. There are people there are constantly struggling to try to get public improvements. They wouldn't mind relocation if it were on site to public housing. They've asked for that. They don't want to be relocated far away. The sewage actually comes out of the shower when it rains because of the backlog, the drains. It's really problematic. They're aware of it. They have leaders who for over a decade have been trying to get public action ineffectively. They don't take action themselves. They're constantly trying to get the public sector to respond ineffectively. And then contrast that with another community we've worked with for many years in the extreme west zone of Rio, where they've taken development into their own hands from the beginning. They built their own sewage system, which I showed earlier. They've named their streets, developed their postal service. They literally took development into their own hands from the beginning. And they also constantly hammer on government to do improvements. But they do both strategies. And they have been effective at not only developing, but actually in the end they have other problems, and they're becoming a bigger rental market as a result of such effective planning, which brings its own unity issues. Anyway, so, but just the idea that a community doing the grassroots work, and the relationship of that to policy, like Michael said, you have that kind of work, it encourages political engagement. The government is much more likely, and at the same time, the second example of the community, they're very aware that, and this follows other strategies, like in the Caño, where the community planned, organized, and then brought in the advisors. Like the Transition Towns movement, which on their list of 12 steps to sustainability, number 9 or something like that, is reaching out to authorities. You need to build local cohesion, unity strategies, so that when the public sector arrives, you can debate and discuss and do things on the terms the community needs as well. And I'd say this is particularly true for consolidated communities.
So we've got about 10 minutes left and about 9 people waiting. Go ahead, Michael. So 9 people waiting to talk here. So let's try to keep it short. Right?
Right. I just want to make, as Max said, we're coming towards the end, and I was just thinking about our conversation and our process. And sort of as one of the fish swimming around in the murky fishbowl, there's a lot of we're bumping into a lot of different characters and species along the way here. I would say, I think, I'm not sure. I think just a couple of reflections about this. In this conversation, after this morning was kind of an uplifting morning. We heard a lot of very positive and interesting cases of ways of coming to grips with local problems, local politics. It was more focused on process. I think the particularly Teresa's comments about process and Michael's comment were very strong and made a big impact. And then I'm a little surprised with the conversation this afternoon, because we haven't really been celebratory about that, and we've kind of switched the frame a lot. But in this switching, what's interesting to me is that there has been hardly any mention of the market, and we really pretty well trashed the market this morning. The market as being kind of predatory with all kinds of negative consequences. So the market has not shown up as a significant actor here. There was a lot of comment against policy and in the state, and I think that Samila made a very good point that it's in everybody's interest to have a state that's actually doing the right thing, and maybe we want to work towards that, but it's not so clear how to do that. I'm missing a lot. There was no mention in this conversation about social justice this afternoon. There were comments about the poor, but there was nothing really about justice, about equality and the balance of resources. I thought that was interesting. I think the introduction of time, of history, played a significant role in this conversation. I think that was really useful. So I'm trying to think about this in relationship to the framing of our whole 3-day experience and interaction here, encounter, and it seems to me that it raises some of the questions about going forward. One of them, I would argue, relates to what Alejandro Echeverria said this morning about the fragility of policy and of politics, sort of the short shelf life of reform and positive movements. How do you sustain that? And so, kind of trying to understand all this, I would end up coming out with a conclusion that, well, the local level interventions are going pretty well in many ways. Maybe they should be, so certainly supported, but maybe left alone to keep doing there because they figured it out what they've got to do. But we really haven't dealt with the broader institutional framework, which is the political framework or the regulation of the market. There was very little discussion about the regulation of the market, and that market, it seems to me, to be predatory and problematic in a lot of places. So in terms of an agenda, I think that it's an interesting question. I guess the other thing that a final point, which is there's been some reference to sort of the international community, or somebody said, I guess the last speaker said the people who benefited most from the slums were the international institutions. I guess we probably should forget about them because they're not really going to help in general, I would say. I think these problems have to be resolved much more at the local level. But there's a lot to be done here. The agenda is pretty substantial. And I think that it was kind of it's problematic, and there's a lot of tension in the conversation, I think, between if the local is sustainable and moving into the right direction, what are the strategies and channels to connect to the higher level that we probably need over time? And the final comment I would make is that I was asked to give a talk a couple of weeks ago at the New School in New York, and I was talking about urban policy and the public interest. And before I started, somebody one of the students put up his hand and said, "I think you made a mistake. It's not the public interest. We don't talk about that anymore. Isn't it urban policy and the private interest?" And it was an interesting sort of temperature of where people are thinking these days. And I think we really have to come back to this question of what is the public interest in this whole conversation.
All right. You want to?
Super quick to that.
Yeah.
Just at the expense of sounding very sappy, and the one hopeful thing, and it is very much building off of what Michael just said, of all of the things, I mean, I don't want to feel like the father that has a favorite child, but of many of the things that moved me, two of the things that moved me today in particular were Alejandro's presentation and then Michael's, and that you didn't say Alejandro almost came close to it, but you were talking about rewriting the social contract. And so there's hope there, and Alejandro, despite the fact that he ends with a caveat, is talking about that. In Medellin is a case where there's an attempt, there's an actual concrete, the plataforma, as saying we have contracts, we're going to actually sign things or document what it is that we're committing to. That's a form of a social contract. Yours, one of the things that just totally shook me was when you said we need to hunker down and create a safe space first. That's a micro way of starting again this social construct and building up. Last point is something that we also haven't been talking about, but it comes up again with Livia's case in the El Caño, and it comes up in the work that we've been doing in Latin America, in particular in Brazil. We haven't talked about lawyers and the law too much. And how, and this is kind of, the lawyers get vilified, we all know that. But in these cases, there are lawyers or people that understand the law that try to redefine and push the boundaries or stretch the law in different ways. So there's work there to be done. There's something that we should kind of continue to look at. The idea of private property, what's going on in Brazil, people are challenging those concepts through the law and the legal framework. That's really important. We haven't talked about that, but that's, thinking about the future and so forth and another research agenda, let's keep that in mind. But I'm leaving somewhat hopeful.
Here you go. Yeah.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
my battery is going to shut down in a
Okay.
moment. So, my name is Mike. I am a LOE fellow from Costa Rica. I would like just to briefly connect with the South Asian Yellow Sea on Latin America, because I think there is something important. I truly believe I represent like emerging collectives back home in Latin America that are under the radar right now. And I think there are three triggers that are very important for us to work. One that is very important is the inspiring action that we have seen in this morning has proven the relevance of accommodating on-site platforms on early stages as touch points. This is key, where the stakeholders can face collectively urban challenges. So this part is very, very critical. I know it sounds very common sense, but usually they don't take this into account. The second, we all agree, everyone has agreed here with the fundamental human right to housing to the city, but furthermore, I would like to add the right to research. It's very important. From a pragmatic perspective, praxis as a strategy that inquires all citizens to document, to ask questions, to learn, and to take action. This part is very important in the broader sense. And finally, I just would like to add that from the current English-speaking global North arena, I consider it's time to challenge the notion, scope, and connotation of the word slum, because this is an approach that I think Alejandro mentioned, and this is very important. We should look into concepts which celebrate identity, dignity, and to avoid all these misleading stigmas. This last one, I know it sounds very silly and common sense, but really I think we need to set a new way to communicate. Otherwise, this is not going to be colloquial, and we're going to keep talking about things that they don't celebrate, the places that we work at. So, thanks. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Ave Tolentino. I'm also a Spurs Humphrey Fellow. And first of all, thanks. I would like to thank everyone for the last 2 days. It has been enriching for me. I'm a civil servant back home before coming in, and there have been a lot of ideas and a lot of it contradicting. It's enriching, but sometimes confusing for someone like me. But I would like with the moving forward part, I would like to make a simple request, if this is possible. If maybe some was done a lot of work in government, those who have been in alliances, those who have been working direct with the communities, if you can share maybe one realization, something that you would have known before, and maybe more importantly, a word of caution. Because if there's any takeaway I've had, there's a lot of ideas here, but my takeaway from the last 2 days is really patience. But the good thing for me is I might have time. Because, yeah, I might have time. So the patience, and I might have time. So if you can please indulge me, get a few, maybe that statement, a realization, and maybe more importantly, a word of caution in your respective fields. If you can facilitate that.
Thanks.
Well, it's just not because I'm also an Humphreys Fellow. I come from Angola. I'm also a civil servant. I work for the central government. I do a lot of some clearance. I dislocate people from one place to another. So, so it's nice. I know that I've heard about all of you guys, but I've never met you. So, to give you, well, and I've never met you because we don't need you in Angola, basically. Basically, what has been said about Nigeria with some differences. Well, thanks to God, we don't have onshore oil. That's one thing. But we have oil, and we have money. And the other thing is that we don't have the kind of, well, after almost 30 years of civil war, so we got that thing, and it's a stabilized country. But it's we might call it authoritarian democracy, where there's a strong party, formal election, so just to, you know. I'm sorry? I'm joking. No, Angola is a formal democracy with a strong party. You could say authoritarian democracy. You can call it what you have, but it's a democracy. You know, we have elections there. Yeah, we have elections there. Well, my point is that, of course, when I say that, with all due respect, because there is here messages of hope, messages of also some despair, some failures and successes and all of what you've done. But someone mentioned the problem of scaling, you know, because we are talking about same thing in Nigeria. It's a 20% formality and 80% slum. So from the perspective of who is in the, well, I'm not political, I'm just a technician, okay? We are not going to waste many time with participatory movements because, in fact, people don't want it. They want a house, you know, and you have to give them a house. I'm not talking about Nigeria. I'm talking about my country, you know. So then it comes the question that was raised by, I think, Michael Cohen. Well, the overall picture, you know, and. The examples, and somebody said we are very jealous of Latin America. No, I'm not jealous of Latin America. I'm jealous of Sweden. I want to be Swedish, and that's what the Angolans want to be. You know, have a Volvo and marry. No. I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not. Good statistics. Good statistics, not high suicide. Yeah. Okay. It's good statistics. Okay, and so of course I'm being provocative. Just to things are not this kind of so simply, but when you have to do mass housing, and this is mass housing we are talking about, we are not, you know, all these things that are very important. I'm not dismissing. I'm talking about this with work that is being done with very respectful in ways, but the outcomes of it, you know, you could say that Latin. I don't have much information, but the outcomes are from the perspective who is on the site, and from a position of government, central government. They are not scaled, you know. We want, the last former president wanted to build 1 million houses. Well, of course he didn't build 1 million houses, but he built 2,000 houses.
They built 5 million empty houses in Mexico, 4 million empty. You can get the scale.
No, but they are not. They are not. No, that's another question, you know. There's a new town in, you can call it whatever you want it. There's a new town that was built in 2012 and that laid like a ghost town for 1 year. But now you go there and so 100% occupied. You know, 25,000 apartments. So there are outcomes, you know, and those outcomes are about numbers. Okay, so when I look at the overall experience, because what we are basically doing, addressing here is addressing the problem of urban poor, of people that don't have, that live in slums, don't have conditions. Who has, in the world, recently achieved the better results? Nicholas, you mentioned them, the examples from Southeast Asia, Singapore, Taiwan. Of course, Hong Kong, I know that there's a lot of troubles now about access to housing. And they dealt with problems of land. I have heard Martin talking about capture of value of land, but they did something very communist. They amassed this, yeah, they picked up land, they buy land. In Singapore, they did so. When you have 70% of the land that belongs to the state, I think this is really socialism. So what they did was to take housing out, not to housing out of the market, and dealt it in a collective way.
I'm going to have to ask you to kind of close up because we have other people waiting and we're running out of time.
I'm going to finish. I'm sorry to be. Okay, that's my point. You know, the cases of more success addressing poor people were not being addressed here. So I'm sorry, with all due respect for everybody.
So I wanted to answer the invitation of Sheila to. I agree that I'm jealous to India too. She invited the people from Latin America in some way to be close to the process of India. So I think in any process of agreement, like in a peace process, you must to develop proximity and proximity to understand the problems. So when you have a very big gap in the way of to understand the situations, how your life is and your preconceptions, but your economy and so on, is very difficult to develop a common discussion. So that happens in the world, the North, the South, and so on. So I strongly believe in the idea of Sheila that, for example, Latin America and India could easily develop a common principles, some people that is working in this problem. And so maybe with limitations, but the advantage to advance, because we have to have some principles to go on, simple ones. And this is going to be very powerful, for sure. And organizations like your organization could support, visibilize, add information, but this engine of dialogue has to happen with proximity and will be very useful for sure in some way. So the second point that I would like to add, if he asked maybe if one idea or that I take from this conversation for me. So from my point of view, the first and the most important thing are the processes. I think everybody is agree about it. But the most important for processes is the continuity. So the question is, in different places happens differently with different agents and so on. So with whom and how you could develop continuity? It's a simple question. In the dialogues between top-down and, you have to have top-down policies, of course. You have to have bottom-up agreements, of course. How to develop continuity. My idea at the end of my presentation was, unfortunately, the politics in Latin America is discontinuity, means discontinuity. See, I believe in public policy, I believe in politics and so on, but the agent that permit and push for solution has to be a different platform, is my approach, yeah.
Can I get you to go last? Because yeah. 2 minutes, okay, real short, right?
Real short, okay. It's difficult because,
Yes, I know.
every time we were commenting something, I'm writing more things, but try to keep it short. Few comments. I think, one, I think it's revealing that we are actually having problems and feeling really uncomfortable in these changing scales all the time. Because, as you know, in physics, that's kind of a common ground, right? I mean, they know that in order to understand the universe, you need to understand particles. And in biology, in order to understand big systems, you need to understand molecules and all that, right? So it's kind of, and actually world visions, indigenous people all over the place for millennia, not just centuries, millennia, were talking about those connections. So people, humans being connected to other forms of lives, and that being connected to the universe, and then even the death, and all that, right? So connections. So why that is so difficult for us to think about connections and changing scales all the time is because our knowledge system has been actually, again, partializing, sectoralizing, all that. So this is a knowledge epistemological crisis. And you all know that, right? And there's several people discussing about this, and they have been for a long time. This is an epistemological crisis. And part of the crisis is, of course, linked with the rationalism and Descartes and all that. So we are humans, that's nature, and we know that that was kind of the beginning of several things that we're seeing right now. And this is crucial. We need to feel comfortable in connecting things and moving around from one scale to the other and being able to talk about this person in this favela as journalists do, actually. Media, they know that very well, that if you want to address a big problem, you need to talk about a personal experience. So why is that it's so difficult for us? We don't need to, even be thinking about this. This is natural, should be our nature again. So let's please go take that back. So a couple of things linked to that. One is memory and history, and we're all discussing processes and continuities and all that. This is fundamental. We all know that space is fundamental, and space and scales, but history and time is also fundamental. And we have been missing that for a long time now. So I'm happy that this is coming back. And part of that is not just the global history, but it's the institutional memory. The institutional memory, and we saw this being a huge problem in the Habitat 3 process. Several of the actors involved in that process, including our friends at UN Habitat, friends at several academic institutions, people at the governments, they didn't know, let's not talk about 200 years ago, just 40 years ago, 20 years ago. That's a problem. That's a big problem, huge problem. So let's just be aware of that, and let's talk about that. Then, of course, we also need to take into account, in order, this discussion about Latin America, Asia, India, etc., and democratization and urbanization. In Latin America, and we haven't talked much about that, there was a parallel between the urbanization process, in particular the industrial urbanization process, and the democratization process. We need to discuss that more, because I can, just a very concrete example, people living in favelas, being social leaders in favela, they were fundamental in the political pressure for changing the democratic spectrum in our countries, actually going back to democracy, and some of those during the progressive decade in several Latin American countries, including many of our fellows, there were ministers, housing ministers, and so on, right? We need to understand this. We need to discuss and make this more explicit. It's not the only explanation, but please don't be jealous, but let's just keep inspiring each other on the good things, not on the bad things, because now, as you know, so-called democratic coup d'etat or legislative coup d'etat and even more open dictatorships are coming back to Latin America. And there's a huge backlash, not just right-wing, let's be clear here. And it's not just happening in this country, you all know that. It's a huge backlash, and it's not just right-wing, it's conservative, and it's not just conservative, it's reactionary, and even pre-modern. We don't have time to discuss this now, but it's also the point of this discussion, right? Because we're talking about growing xenophobia in the slums, of course, because it's growing in the society. Growing xenophobia being really fuel up, right? Growing xenophobia, misogynia, homophobia, racism, all together, the same package. So we are facing a pre-modern discussion, a pre-modern society. And that's why it's connecting with the hope and with the good things. That's why there are several people discussing this from different levels, and one way to name this, and we're going to see this in Buenos Aires, you might know, at the end of November in Buenos Aires is going to be the meeting of the G20. A month before that, so at the end of October, is going to be a meeting called the Urban 20. The Urban 20, some of the mayors of those countries, not just the capitals, some of the mayors of those countries, convened by Buenos Aires and Paris, are going to discuss the city's role in that discussion vis-a-vis the G20, etc. So several organizations, including our networks and some others, like the New Schools and some others, are organizing like a meeting, international gathering, civil society, grassroots, etc., on equal cities or ciudades igualitarias. The cities, we are going to invite progressive mayors into that meeting, and cities are actually making a manifesto, like a declaration of cities for the right to housing and the right to the city, claiming for more powers to actually confront these global real estate actors and so on. And it's not a coincidence that we have in every single country politicians being real estate developers or having close linkages between real estate developers. Please show me a country where that's not the case, and we can study that country, because it's everywhere. Small cities, big cities, everywhere.
You got to wrap up. You got to wrap up.
Finally, we're going to see there, the hope side is linked with the feminist approach. And the feminist approach is not just having female mayors, like the mayor from Barcelona, Ada Colau, and some others, with a very strong voice, naming and shaming, and having very brave actions against some of these corporate actors. But a feminist approach will be what kind of society and then what kind of cities we need, including the infrastructure, that will be a society for caring, a society for taking care of life, for taking care of everything that we need to actually reproduce the life in our cities, and not just human life. This is called the economy of care, and there are several economists discussing this, feminist economists, not only women discussing this, but that's actually reflected in our society. Part of the issues we were discussing about the favelas is those things are already happening because the exchange value and money and greed is not actually the thing, driven the community. They're all the things. So actually the feminist approach will be to look what's going on in those places, to actually try to learn from that, because looking forward is actually looking backwards and trying to learn something from the past. Thank you.
Thank you. I can pick up exactly on that. I was very interested in, and I hope that we'll put down in the minutes for follow-up conversations, the idea of identifying market gaps and niches where income-producing and income-generating activities can take place, such as in the economy of care that could be paid. And Fernando de Mello, when he was talking about urban, spoke very interestingly of the need for businesses to be created to do on-site upgrading of existing consolidated housing projects and public housing projects and upgraded favelas. So I thought we'd like to have more eventually on his upgrading kits. What was that kit, and how many people can earn a living from that, and earn a living from improving the environment, and earn a living from all the things, because without having income, no other programs really can do it. I mean, you can never put enough conditional cash transfers or any other things. So upgrading won't do it. Okay, that was one. The second thing I'd like to say, and this is just very brief. Yes, we did mention social justice. We might not have said those words, social justice, but the entire time we've been here, we have been talking about social justice from the first second of this meeting, from the first films that were shown, from the first reactions to those films. So please don't tell me that we haven't talked about social justice. That is totally impossible to say after we have heard all of the impassioned talks that have to do with social justice and equality and inequality. And what I wanted to say about the frameworks between the local, global, and all that level is about power. I wanted to come back to power very briefly and just say it's a power question whether you're working at the territorial level doing squatter upgrading or empowerment or trust building, or you're working at the livelihoods level that Marty Chen was talking about and helping the informal economy flourish, or whether you're working at the human rights level and fighting for the right to the city or the right to be. So it's all about power at every level and interact, and then we have to make a great alliance between people. We can't all work at all levels. We can bridge. Some of us here are very good at bridging, but we need people who are only doing one of those levels with their whole life. And to end, I want to go back to something I learned when I was studying grassroots social movements and community-based organizations, and it probably comes from Saul Alinsky. They talk in community organizing about building three things: building power, building community, and building people. And I just wanted to leave for reflection on our agenda. Building power, if you're a grassroots person and you're poor, is usually a very temporary thing. Because if you stop a freeway, if you're a community organization in Boston or New York and they're doing urban renewal, and you mobilize and people come out and they get daycare and you fight and you prevent that freeway from coming through your neighborhood, it's like pushing a boulder up the hill. It's like a Sisyphusian effort. The minute you stop to breathe, the gravity of the system pushes that back down. You look away for 1 second, and that's wiped away. So that is one of the problems we have about continuity. The second part about building community is an incredibly powerful and natural thing when there's an outside threat. But when some of the struggles are won collectively and people feel they know what it feels like to be successful, and maybe they get tenure or this or that. That's when the community building has to really start to be tested, because that can fragment, and many people have mentioned the difference of, within a community, how different stakeholders are. That community can also be eroded. So I want to end with the last one, which is building people. Anyone who I've known who's been in a social movement or worked collectively at any of these levels and fought and seen even the smallest change that can be created by numbers of poor people versus this powerful moneyed and political elite, they have something inside them that no one can take away. They can carry that. They can carry that to any experience they go to. And that's why the people who worked in some of these wonderful municipalities, Sao Paulo and other places, who had the experience of trying many new things, wherever they go, I don't know, the people who worked in the Megacities project in the 20 cities we worked in, wherever those, including Rahul Malhotra, and wherever they go, and Enrique Ortiz, they are carrying some of that experience that they saw worldwide with them and doing it other places. So I end up with people. I think what we're doing and what we're trying to do here is, and what this conference has done beautifully, is bring people together to help support what we're doing and what we're doing with the groups and networks we're in and the networks that they're in and the networks that they're in. So I thank you very much.
I will be extraordinarily brief because I have to catch an airplane to go on vacation. So why I even came up here is beyond me, really. As a student of urban politics, I want to underscore and just expand a little bit on what came, which is, yes, we want to focus on what people did. We also should be focusing, I think as Janice has just eloquently articulated as usual, on how they did it. And I think particularly, and I love, I'm sorry I don't know your name, the points that you made. All of the interesting interventions here happened in some way, shape, or form of an interaction between some entity or group of people who represented something called community, whatever that is, and a group of individuals active in a power structure, typically around landed interests, what in, at least in American political science, we would call growth machines. I would encourage folks in this room to look at those successes, which are in many respects the anomalies, and pay very close attention to what those interactions looked like. Those experiments were answers to some question, and maybe to pick up where Max started us, if slums were the answer to some question, understanding why particular interventions emerged in particular times in interactions with powerful forces may turn out to reveal really important insights and strategies for moving forward.
So thanks, David. And thank you all for really, really engaging 2.5 days. It's been really thought-provoking, and it's been unsettling, and it's been a lot of things, but what it really has been is just another part of the process. One of the things we celebrated all morning was the process that led to a lot of the successes that we saw that were done locally. And this is just another step in the process where we begin to spread possibly a more nuanced understanding, some better ideas, maybe some more dissonance out there that can help us to really grapple very differently and with a different kind of, I don't know, different understanding. But our goal was to just bring you from, on this journey from kind of the desperate ways that we've depicted slums to some of the really exciting and interesting things that are going on. And part of this discussion was not to close the box and tie it up with a nice bow, but to kind of open up the discussion and get us all now to go out and kind of think differently and talk differently and engage differently. And I think one of our next steps at Lincoln is going to be finding a way to convene the leaders of favelas and slums and get them to share some insights with us. And maybe we'll do that starting in Latin America so the Asians can be jealous. So thanks. Yeah, we'll do it there, yeah. Definitely the proximity thing, absolutely, right?
So I just want to say thank you.
Oh, I might have turned that off, sorry. This one's on.
Thank you to a number of people. The title of this is Slums, New Visions for an Enduring Global Phenomena. There's a certain arrogance behind that, right? That we are coming together to say, we're going to come here, gather you at Harvard, and after 2.5 days have a new vision. I think the one thing, the way in which I think the new vision comes is not at a kind of global, we've unified answer to the fundamental question, but I think it comes from individually, personally, saying, do you come out of here with a new vision? And I want to thank the advisory committee we put together. This was organized by the Lincoln Institute, the Joint Center, Rahul Malhotra, the GSD. We modeled this after a process Mac helped institute at Ford, where we got an advisory committee together to help us advise us as we cooked up our ideas. A number of people you've heard from today, Alejandra Jorilla, Brody Fisher, Edgar Pierce, Nicholas Yu, among others, Ranjani and Sheila Patel were part of that. When we put it together, the first go-around of this, it was more academic. And the feedback we got said, no, you need different voices. And I think that I took away from this was we heard a lot of different voices. And I mentioned at the outset there's different disciplines, but beyond that there's different seats at the table that were here. And I know personally I have a new vision for slums coming out of this. And I hope if you're sitting here and you don't, we didn't succeed. So I apologize to you. But I think that's one measure of success. But the other, I think, goes back to Michael's question, the question that came out yesterday is, what is to be done? And so I think the question is, if you come out of here with a new vision, I hope you leave here saying, what is to be done by me? Rahul raised the question of scale. We all operate at different scales. And I think the question is, what is to be done by all of us sitting at different scales? And hopefully what comes out of this is a greater alignment of that understanding, so that when we're operating at different scales, we're not operating in opposition, but in more unity. So clearly a big theme has been the community. We've vetted, in some sense, the challenges of what it means to be a community. But it starts, what is to be done starts with the question is, what's the problem? And you can't answer the question, what's the problem, without talking to the community on an ongoing basis. So I hope you leave here with a new vision. I hope you leave here with a new commitment to what is to be done. And thank you all for what you've done.